Welcome to the Minnesota Gambling Control Board Gambling Manager Seminar Review Sessions. Some general notes regarding these review sessions and tips moving forward. The sessions are optional and are not required for Gambling Manager licensure. The sessions are also not intended to be a replacement for the Gambling Manager Seminar class, which has much more comprehensive information. Rather, the sessions focus on some of the more impactful items to consider when getting started in your gambling operation and on historically troublesome areas of compliance. Each review session corresponds to roughly 1/3 of the Gambling Manager Seminar class, and each session recording can be briefly paused if needed to allow for further consideration of, or even further research of, an elusive topic. At the end of each session, some quiz questions will be both asked and answered. Note that the questions for the quiz come from the current day's review material or simply from the Gambling Manager Seminar class at large. A very important reminder: if there is ever any gray area in your mind as to the answer to a given question stemming from your gambling operation, it is essential to reach out to your county's compliance or licensing specialist for a definitive answer. We all know from daily life that assumptions sometimes prove incorrect, and in the case of charitable gambling, incorrect assumptions can and often do lead to reimbursements of monies back to the gambling account, citations, and/or other repercussions. Organizations that are regularly in contact with their Gambling Control Board specialists almost without exception more effectively stay compliant with gambling statute and rule, meaning fewer citations or other sanctions, and also meaning generally less eventful or troublesome compliance audits and inspections. Review session number 2. Today's topics include monthly processes and procedures, or things you need to be aware of on a monthly basis, lawful gambling expenditures, comparing allowable expenses versus lawful purpose expenditures, and things to understand about rent to your lessor. Monthly processes and procedures. Many gambling managers struggle with knowing where to begin, and here we will focus on 3 different required monthly processes and procedures to keep in mind. They are monthly reporting to the Gambling Control Board and other agencies, physical month-end inventory, and your organization's monthly gambling report to membership. Monthly reporting. Your organization is required each month to send in reporting to both the Gambling Control Board and the Minnesota Department of Revenue. For the Gambling Control Board, there are 3 forms that must be submitted each month, the first of which, Form LG100A, is shown here. The reporting for a given month is due by the 20th of the following month, but because of potential reporting issues or technology problems, groups should shoot for putting together and submitting their reporting much earlier than the 20th. Give yourself at least a week or more of leeway to avoid prospective late reporting violations. The earlier the better. One important tip as a gambling manager or CEO is to ensure that you are monitoring the contents of the reporting being sent, even if you have gambling software doing the heavy lifting or perhaps an accountant doing and submitting a reporting each month. It is essential that you are aware of issues or concerns with the reporting. In particular, you want to look for patterns as far as the average values on the various lines. This helps you notice when a given value jumps significantly from its typical value, at which point your response should be to inquire as to why. This could be random variation, but it could also be an indicator of a problem that has surfaced in your gambling operation. Form LG100A shown here is used to report both gambling revenues as well as allowable expense monies spent at a given site. Because this type of reporting is specific to a particular site, you will be submitting a separate Form LG100A for each active site in your gambling operation. While all lines on the form have their own significance, one line to pay particular attention to here is line 22, cash shortages. Careful monitoring of cash shortages at each site is essential so that prompt investigation and proactive measures can be undertaken when cash shortages significantly differ from their monthly average. Significant jumps in cash shortages may sometimes have innocent explanations, but in other cases they can of course indicate theft of gambling funds or other serious concerns. Another form submitted each month is Form LG100C, shown here. The LG100C reports lawful purpose expenditures during the month. Generally speaking, lawful purpose expenditures include donations and also lawful gambling expense-related taxes and licensing fees. These expenses tend to be at the organization rather than at the site level, and so only a single organizational Form LG100C is submitted each month. We'll further consider lawful purpose expenditures and compare and contrast them to allowable expense expenditures later in this session. The final form sent in each month is Form LG100F, shown here. The LG100F reconciles your gambling fund, which for those of you who have experienced balancing a personal checkbook, works much the same way. In essence, the form entails determining what your operation quote-unquote has to its name and comparing that to what the organization theoretically should have to its name based on where you were last month and the revenues and expenses that occurred during the current month. If all transactions during the month were accounted for properly, then these two values, actual versus theoretical, will precisely match. If the values do not match, then it results in what's called a profit carryover variance, and efforts to resolve the variance should be undertaken immediately. In practice, a variance will show up as a non-zero value on line 28 of the LG100F. Accordingly, line 28 of the LG100F is another line in your reporting that it is essential to monitor carefully, and proactive measures should be promptly undertaken whenever the value differs from zero. If left unaddressed, and a variance is allowed to continue over several months or more, it can prove very costly, as this is often resolved by hiring an accountant to review and re-report all months for which the variance has been occurring. It is not at all unheard of for such accounting costs to the organization to run into the multiple thousands of dollars. The physical month-end inventory is another monthly requirement for your organization. Form LG846, shown here, is one form used for that purpose to track barcoded games such as pull tabs, tip boards, and paddle wheel. A separate LG846 is needed to track each of those different types of gambling. If your organization conducts paper bingo, the paper for the bingo must also be accounted for, and the month-end inventory form used for that purpose is Form LG903. Note that if you have gambling management software, which is recommended, the software will generally have its own version of each of these types of physical inventory forms, and also generally of the various other forms seen in these review sessions, for that matter. In practice, the physical month-end inventory is a process by which someone other than the person in charge of ordering games and bingo paper goes to each gambling site and verifies that the amount of pull tab games and other games and bingo paper at the site precisely matches what is expected, based on the amount of games closed and bingo paper used at the site during the month. This month-end process must always be completed within the first few days of the next month, the sooner the better, and the person conducting the inventory must sign and date the inventory form when finished. If a discrepancy is found when conducting the inventory, it should be immediately investigated. Let's consider an example. If the organization's main or perpetual inventory suggests that as of the end of the month there should have been 5 particular unplayed pull tab games and 2 particular in-play games at a given site, then the person conducting the physical inventory goes to the site to ensure that this is precisely the case. In practice, the 7 total games are listed on the physical inventory form, which the verifier then takes to the site and checks off each game on the list after verifying their presence. If using gambling management software, the 7-game list can simply be printed out and used for this purpose. Otherwise, the list would be handwritten on Form LG-846 and provided to the individual conducting the inventory. If a discrepancy is found, it should be immediately investigated. If a couple of pull tab games were apparently missing, for example, is it possible that they were actually played and closed and the perpetual inventory not updated to reflect that? If so, then the perpetual inventory should be promptly updated. Alternatively, is it possible that the games were placed in a different secure location at the site, for example, for an upcoming special event? In that scenario, no corrective action is needed. All that said, if apparently missing games or bingo paper cannot ultimately be located, or also in the case where gambling funds have gone missing, then the situation needs to be addressed immediately as a potential fund loss or theft. To minimize your organization's potential liability in such cases, two distinct courses of action come into play when a fund loss is detected. The first of those is reporting the loss to local law enforcement, and the second is reporting the loss to the Gambling Control Board. Reporting a fund loss to local law enforcement is required within 4 days of discovering the loss. If the loss happens to have occurred specifically through theft from a pull tab dispensing device, the requirement is even shorter, only 1 day. In any case, it is of course wise to always report to law enforcement immediately, just as you might if encountering a theft of your own personal assets. Reporting a fund loss to the Gambling Control Board is done by means of completing and submitting Form LG-250. To help reduce potential liability to your organization, the LG-250 needs to be submitted within 60 days of the discovery of the loss. This longer time window affords your organization time to fully determine and document all that has gone missing and the circumstances involved. Provided that each of these actions is completed in the time frames mentioned, then your organization's potential liability for the loss can be considered on its own merits. Your organization may or may not be held accountable for the loss, depending on the circumstances. If, however, either of these actions were to not be completed within the required timeframes, then your organization may well be held accountable for the loss, which could entail reimbursing the amount of the loss back to the gambling account and/or other repercussions. The third and final required monthly process we'll consider here is the monthly gambling report to members. The form has two main functions. First, it lays out requirements for information pertaining to the gambling operation that must be readily and regularly available to membership. Page 1 of the form, shown here, helps guide that process. At the monthly meeting, gambling managers typically give a brief verbal report informing members of the most commonly sought after gambling-related information, such as the balance of funds in the gambling account, recent or ongoing gambling revenues and expenses, and the like. On top of providing this verbal briefing, though, is a requirement of more comprehensive information pertaining to the gambling operation being readily and regularly available to membership. The right side of page 1 of the form here lists the information that must readily be available, and the left side indicates the typical organizational documents that provide the information. Copies of recent versions of these documents should therefore be readily available to membership, typically accomplished by including them in the minutes for the meeting. Some organizations additionally provide this information by putting together a portable file folder box with sections corresponding to the 7 categories shown here, and placing in the sections copies of the recent versions of the documents listed. The file folder box is then brought to each monthly meeting. In that scenario, discussing all the documentation and information in it is not required. Rather, members can simply be allowed to peruse the materials at their own discretion as the meeting proceeds, bringing forth questions or concerns that might come to mind. The transparency that readily available information creates is invaluable to each gambling operation. It is essential that membership feels that gambling-related information is readily forthcoming from the gambling manager and other gambling operation leadership. The second main function of Form LG 1004 is to facilitate another essential charitable gambling requirement: pre-approval by membership of all gambling-related expenses. Page 2 of the form, shown here, lays out an efficient means of gaining this pre-approval. Approval of expenses is broken into allowable expense expenditures and lawful purpose expenditures. Allowable expenses are expenses specifically needed to help the gambling operation run. And as indicated earlier, lawful purpose expenditures generally include charitable donations and payment of gambling-related taxes and fees. We'll get more extensively into comparing and contrasting allowable expenses and lawful purpose expenditures shortly, after considering how page 2 shown here can be used to gain pre-approval for expenditures in each of these two areas. First, each prospective expenditure to be considered at the meeting is listed on the form, each in its own row. Items that recur monthly, and for which the amount varies, are handled by approving an up to or limit amount. For example, if your organization averages spending $300 per month to purchase pull tab games, an entry could be included that lists a limit amount of $500. This can accommodate an unusually busy month without exceeding the amount approved by membership. Lawful purpose expenditures, such as donations and the like, are typically chosen in precise amounts, so no limit amount is included on that portion of the form. Once the form is fully complete, copies of it can be made and distributed at the meeting, making consideration of the various expenses straightforward and efficient. Each prospective expenditure must be approved by membership according to your normal quorum and voting requirements. It is very important to understand that the gambling manager, CEO, or other leadership in the organization do not have the authority to go against this vote by the membership. Gambling managers in particular should think of themselves as facilitators, whose job is to bring knowledge and recommendations to the membership when making expenditure decisions. They should not think of themselves as someone having unilateral authority to make or override these decisions themselves. In conclusion, we hope you find Form LG 1004 to be a useful tool in helping meet requirements for your organization's monthly gambling report to membership. Organized monthly reports and readily available information create the feeling of transparency that is important in all well-run charitable gambling operations. Now let's turn to our next major review topic for today, lawful gambling expenditures. Recall that in order to be lawful, even with organization pre-approval, gambling expenditures must qualify as either allowable expenses or as lawful purpose expenditures. Let's look more closely now at each of these categories and compare and contrast them a bit. First, we'll look at allowable expenses. The defining aspect of allowable expense expenditures is that they are needed to run the gambling operation. Some common allowable expense examples include pull tab or other games being purchased for play, compensation to members of the gambling organization, such as a gambling manager's salary, or gambling organization office supplies used in running the operation. Note that whether something is needed for an operation can seem subjective. Be sure to keep it real when evaluating if something is truly needed. If your organization were to reason, our gambling team needs a bow and arrow for our gambling operation in order to keep morale high, this would most decidedly be off the beaten path and would incur reimbursement and potential other repercussions. Bottom line, when in doubt as to whether a potential expense qualifies as an allowable expense, reach out to your county's compliance specialist to determine if it qualifies before issuing payment. One aspect of allowable expenses important to understand with owned gambling sites is the potential use of gambling funds to partially cover the cost of shared items. First, it is important to emphasize that this concept only potentially applies to owned gambling sites. since for other gambling operations, such as bar operations and booth operations at rented sites, the rent being paid to the lessor is all-inclusive, meaning that gambling cannot make any other payments to the lessor aside from the rent check each month. This means the lessor is not allowed to purchase things on behalf of the gambling operation and later be reimbursed by gambling. The single rent check going to the lessor each month must include only the cost of rent. Turning our attention back to owned gambling sites then, certain types of resources are sometimes shared between the general club operation and the gambling operation. Examples of that might be a shared printer, the garbage bill, or even employees who split their work time between work for the general operation and work for the gambling operation. Use of gambling funds to pay shared employees, in particular, requires one additional step. A time study must be done by the organization in which they carefully consider and determine the percentage of each employee's time that is used in supporting the gambling operation. As always, keep these estimates real in order to avoid uncomfortable conversations and potential reimbursements down the line. In any case, gambling can pick up a portion of the cost of allowable expense items shared between the general operation and the gambling operation, as per the following two guidelines. First, the amount gambling can pay for a given shared item is prorated and corresponds directly to gambling's percent of usage of the item. For example, if considering a purchase of a printer that will be shared by the general operation and the gambling operation, and approximately 1/3 of the use of the printer will be for gambling, then gambling can pay 1/3 of the cost of the printer, and the general operation would pick up the remaining cost. The second guideline to consider is that separate checks or payments must be issued to pay for a given shared item, one each from the general fund and the gambling fund. Monies are not at all allowed to be moved back and forth between the general fund and the gambling fund so that a single payment can be issued to a vendor. As a general side note, movement of monies between general and gambling is highly restricted and only allowed in some very specialized situations. If you are unsure as to what cases qualify, reach out to your compliance specialist before money is moved between the accounts. In the end, the vendor or employee will always need to receive two separate payments in situations where a shared resource is being paid for at least partly out of gambling. Let's now turn to consideration of lawful purpose expenditures. Recall that generally speaking, lawful purpose expenditures entail charitable donations, payment of gambling-related taxes and fees, and other assorted items. To further understand lawful purpose expenditures, we will next look at some useful lawful purpose expenditure related documents and forms. The Lawful Purpose Code Summary Document, Form LG 555, and a document known as a 501c3 designation letter. The Lawful Purpose Expenditures Code Summary document, shown here, summarizes the broad range of 26 different categories, or A codes, of lawful purpose expenditures. For a prospective lawful purpose expenditure to be lawful, it must fit into one of these 26 categories. You in your role will likely be approached by charities, members of your organization, or others in the community hoping for donations or other expenditures of gambling funds. The essential question to always ask is, does such an expenditure clearly fit under one of the 26 lawful purpose codes? And this summary document is invaluable in helping answer that question. That said, if it's unclear based on this document if a prospective lawful purpose expenditure qualifies under one of the codes, then there is also an entire chapter in the Lawful Gambling Manual dedicated to providing more detailed information for each category. In the end, if still unsure whether a given expenditure qualifies as lawful purpose, be sure to reach out to your compliance specialist. Going through all of the lawful purpose codes shown here is beyond the scope of this review. However, we can touch on a few of them, particularly some of the ones for which additional documentation is either required or helpful to keep in your long-term records. First, A few of the codes here pertain to what are referred to as government entity donations, highlighted in purple here. Government entities have their own usage and reporting requirements regarding gambling monies donated to them, and so there is an extra form required to be completed by both your organization and the receiving government group, Form LG 555. We'll consider the LG 555 further momentarily, but first let's make note of the various lawful purpose A-code donations that require this additional form to be completed. First, since public schools are considered a unit of government, donations to them require the LG 555 and are allowable under code A4. Next, donations to a city or a county also require the LG 555 and are allowable under code A10. Finally, donations specifically to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency or to the DNR each require Form LG 555 and are allowable under codes A12 and A13, respectively. Let's now take a brief look at Form LG 555 itself, which is shown here. The top half of the form is completed by your organization as the group donating gambling funds, and the bottom half is completed by the government entity as the receiving group. Once the LG 555 is fully completed and signed by both parties, keep a copy in your records for 3.5 years, as with your other gambling records. Let's turn our attention now to a particular A-code donation category that is both frequently used and frequently misused: code A1 donations. First, we'll go over some basic information to understand about A1 donations, and then we'll take a look at an important supporting document that ensures the lawfulness of A1 donations. As the purple box here highlights, A1 as a category pertains to donations specifically to 501c3 groups or to 501c4 festival groups, whose primary mission is supporting an annual community festival. First, with regards to 501c4 festival groups, the festival designation is granted based on internal Gambling Control Board guidelines, so it is important to reach out to your compliance specialist before issuing payment to determine if a 501c4 group in question actually qualifies. 501c3 contributions, perhaps the most common type of charitable gambling donation, can be just as challenging to vet out. One of the difficulties is that many groups being considered for gambling funds donations do not understand the difference between a 501c3 and a nonprofit and mistakenly think of those two terms as interchangeable. In reality, a 501c3 is one type of nonprofit, which means that all 501c3s are nonprofits, but not all nonprofits are classified as 501c3s. Long story short, when a group hoping for a gambling funds donation approaches your organization and verbally assures you that they are a 501c3, this assurance by itself may not at all be reliable. To protect your organization from having to reimburse an A1 donation that was improperly made under this type of misunderstanding, your organization will always want to require nonprofits seeking such donations to provide a copy of their determination letter from the IRS. Upon receiving a copy of that letter and verifying that the group is in fact a 501c3, the 3 is essential, your group can safely go ahead and issue payment after gaining the customary membership approval. Keep a copy of the determination letter in your records in case questioned about the 501c3 status of the group during an audit down the road. Note that the Gambling Control Board can verify 501c3 status for many groups using databases at our disposal. So if a group ever provides a designation letter that seems suspect, you can alternatively reach out to your compliance specialist for guidance. On screen now is a generic sample 501c3 letter from the IRS. The area highlighted in the lower red box shows the verbiage you would want to see to be confident that the group is in fact a 501c3. The final aspect for gambling organizations to understand when making donations to verified 501c3 groups under code A1 is to be sure to make the donations payable to the legal name specified on the IRS determination letter. The upper red box in the sample letter shown here shows where the organization's legal name would be listed. If an organization asks that you make a donation check to an alternative name, inform them that you are required to issue payment to the name on the letter and that you would need a new determination letter to issue payment differently. Now let's turn briefly to our final review topic for today, rent for a leased gambling site. Calculation of the monthly rent amount is a pretty complex topic. An overpayment of rent, which will without exception ultimately need to be reimbursed, turns out to be a frequently occurring violation. Charitable gambling statute and rule limits how much rent can be paid, and the amount ultimately paid or allowable is also impacted by the lease that has been negotiated, by the types of gambling being conducted at the site, and even as discussed previously by cash shortages at the site if it is a bar operation. The takeaway here is that in order to avoid potential costly reimbursements, careful attention needs to be given to calculating and paying rent each month. Should your organization be using gambling management software, the good news is that currently existing softwares on the market generally handle this complex issue without much trouble. Otherwise, though, if your organization is manually determining rent amounts each month, the form you are seeing on screen, Form LG-216, is a great tool designed for this purpose. It is in the form of a Microsoft Excel file with built-in macros that walk you through the completion of the form step by step. The form is also available on the Gambling Control Board website in PDF form for printing out and completing in hard copy if desired. While walking through the LG-216 in its entirety is beyond the scope of this review, be sure to make note of this form as a great resource for ensuring accurate monthly rent calculation. A final essential point to make regarding rent is that it is considered all-inclusive. This means that no other rent payments may be made to the lessor outside of the rent payment itself, and the single rent payment each month must only be for rent. Thus, any lessor approaching your organization pushing for, in addition to their normal monthly rent payment, the use of gambling funds to offset some of their costs must be informed in no uncertain terms that only the single rent payment from gambling funds is allowable each month. Note that even the use of your organization's general club funds to enhance gambling rent is prohibited as an extension of this same principle. One common means by which licensed gambling groups inadvertently end up going astray from this requirement is through reimbursements to the lessor, which are also prohibited. An example of this type of violation we've seen on occasion is the lessor fronting the money for meat packs for meat raffles being conducted at a leased site, followed by the gambling organization reimbursing them for the cost of the meat. Such a reimbursement is in fact a violation of the all-inclusiveness of rent. And now for today's review session quiz. A reminder that the questions for the quiz come either from material discussed today or from the Gambling Manager class at large. As you work your way through the quiz, feel free to pause the recording so that you have time to fully consider or even research a given question before its answer is then provided. Good luck! Question number 1. How many days to contact local law enforcement once theft of gambling funds or of games is discovered? And how many days to turn in Form LG-250 to the Gambling Control Board if hoping to not be held accountable for the loss? Answer: your organization has 4 days to report this event to local law enforcement. 1 day if the theft happens to come from a pull-tab dispensing device. Further, Form LG-250 must be turned into the Gambling Control Board within 60 days of the discovery of the loss. Question number 2. True or false? Gambling can pay the full salary of a bartender that also sells pull tabs behind the bar at an owned gambling site. Answer: false. Compensation in this scenario is a shared allowable expense, and as such, payment of the employee's salary must be prorated, with the gambling paying the percentage of the salary equivalent to the percentage of the employee's time spent in performing gambling-related duties. Also recall that in this scenario, the employee is to receive separate checks from the general fund and the gambling fund, with no transfer of monies between the two accounts. Question number 3. By what date of the following month is a given month's reporting due? Answer: a given month reporting is due by the 20th of the following month. Remember to shoot for reporting a week or two ahead of the 20th to give yourself plenty of time to research reporting concerns that can surface, such as a profit carryover variance or values on some reporting lines differing significantly from what's typical. Starting early also provides time to address computer or other technology issues that may arise. Question number 4. What must a licensed gambling group do in order to donate funds to another licensed organization? Answer: aside from the customary membership pre-approval needed for all donations of gambling funds, a licensed gambling group must also gain Gambling Control Board pre-approval before making this type of donation. This is required because such donations have potential implications pertaining to each licensed group's annual lawful purpose expenditure requirements. Question number 5. True or false? All bills for the gambling organization must be paid within 60 days of the invoice date. Answer: false. The requirement is actually to pay organizational bills within 30 days of the invoice date. Perhaps one way to remember that is to consider the analogy of personal credit card bills, which generally must also be paid within 30 days, to avoid interest anyway. That concludes review session number 2 for the Gambling Manager Seminar. Thanks for listening.